Hi, welcome back for our third and final part with the fabulous Ulcca Hansen. So we've been talking about the future of smart, and in part one, we talked about sort of the premise of the book and trying to step back and think about the idea of how we are working with our students to begin to imagine what smart looks like, which is a bit different from the narrow conception of success that has very much been part of the industrialized model. And in part two, we spent time thinking about this kind of all hands on deck mindset. So what is the core and this precious opportunity that we have right now to begin to imagine a new way of thinking and working and imagining as to what schools can be and become. And our third part is really starting to now think about those kind of concrete steps. One, things that Ulcca you've seen since the book has been released. So a couple of concrete examples, but also as we started to chat offline about these kind of small, bold, systemic opportunities, moves that you can make to ensure that the community is engaged regardless of the directions that you're heading into. So thank you again, Ulcca, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And so let's get started with the idea of what generally you've seen after the book's been released. I know you've been keynoting internationally. You also have a fabulous podcast, which we'll go ahead and link in the notes down below in the interview. But you're also on the ground engaging in conversations with parents, with educators, with students as well. So just give it one or two insights on what you've seen.
I think what I'm finding most compelling and exciting is that we're having new conversations about things that we've always taken for granted. So you used the term rigor, right? That we kind of talked about in the first part, and this notion of rigor, like what is it, right? And is there one standard for it, or is it actually about who a young person is and where we can sort of put them in that zone of proximal development and sort of push them? So kind of flexibility around those areas. I think we're having young people speaking up more and more and saying, you know what, I want to feel purposeful. I want to feel like I am doing something in my education that's meaningful. I think we have parents who are asking the question, what can I do to kind of keep some of the excitement going for my child? Parents who had their kids in pods, or parents who had their kids online but with their child having a lot of time at home, but sort of asking the question, like, what can I do as they go back to school to keep that alive? And then I think for educators, it's been interesting. I think it was hard to be online. I think there's a renewed joy in being together with young people, but I think this recognition and this attention to relationship and sort of starting off the years, the academic years with, who are you and what's important to you? And that's taking the form of, different ways of starting the classroom, like starting the year, people experimenting with things like genius hours. What happens if you give students a bit more of a say? Yes, we continue to do the curriculum, and we also add this in. So those are some things that I've seen and heard in the conversations in schools that I visited that I think are exciting.
So let's talk about spheres of influence as we're starting to make small, deliberate, bold moves in sort of reframing, reimagining, redesigning education. So what does it look like from a school leader's point of view, whether they're the leader of a district or a division, or they're a leader of a particular building?
So I'll give a specific example and then sort of generalize out. But have been talking with a couple of principals, and I talked about this a little bit in part two, that are saying, how do we use time differently? How do we use time differently to try and, yes, get students quote unquote caught up or back where they need to be on basics around literacy and numeracy? And how can we use time to give adults, both educators, but interestingly enough, also community players, whether it's cultural groups or local, museums, to come into the school and to kind of provide 6-week, 8-week kind of blocks of learning or classes where you kind of rotate. And so this question of time and how do we use it differently And how do we give kids more of what they need during it, I think has been really interesting. I think there's also a couple of leaders who are saying, you know what, we're going to pause as a school community, and we're going to do a book study. So I've been excited that the future of SMART has been used in book studies as an opening for, we're coming back together, and what do we want to build into? And maybe it's not this year because there's a lot of fires that we have to put out, but how can we start taking small steps? And I think that's really promising. I think it's exciting educators again. And I think they're doing the book studies with their parents,
Yeah,
and communities, inviting folks in, which is also great, right? I think parents and community are an important voice in all of this.
absolutely. And, I think it's so incredibly interesting that when COVID started, there was this kind of just precious moment where parents and schools were connected in such an intimate way, in the fact that learning was showing up in their living rooms, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to think about in what ways, when you have a window into the learning, how can we begin to strengthen that partnership? How can we continue to engage with the networking of ideas? And the fact that the parents have a very clear and impactful voice on what learning looks like at home, but really starting to think about the bridging, not just of their individual child, but also what they can continue to add value as part of a place-based experience.
Yeah. No, there's that. And there's also, I'll link this article by Deborah Ball, who argues that actually those of us who go into education, we often go into education because we enjoyed it and it worked for us. And I think the other reason to have parents engaged and involved is because they're often the ones who have insight into what it is to be, someone for whom maybe school wasn't always fun or didn't always work. And so have some really fabulous ideas because of who they were and their own experiences. And then knowing their children about, how else could you do things differently, right? To kind of actually make it work. And I thought that article was really interesting. I'd never thought about it in quite that way. And how do we take this moment to kind of expand the voices in the community to say, hey, you can do education in different ways, and we can be partners in helping that to happen. And community groups and things like that are other vehicles for that.
Well, and speaking about community groups, can you give a concrete example from a sphere of influence of what happens when a community sort of pauses and starts to reflect and reorient what school should be looking like?
So my favorite example of that is Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where at this point it's probably 10 years ago. There was a big flood and the city was devastated, and they brought all these, business people, civic leaders, educators, parents, community leaders together to say, what do we want? And a big question was school. And they did this profile of a graduate exercise, like, what do we want young people to be? And they made this big list, and then they made everybody go back to school for a day. So they had to go to high school and shadow a student for a day. And then they brought all those people back and they said, so what'd you think? And everyone just looked at the list they had made about what they wanted for young people. And they were like, there's no way kids are going to get there by doing this every day. And that began what they called the Billy Madison Project that birthed Iowa Big, which is a very different model of high school. That's a collaboration among 3 districts, and students go to high school for part of the time, more traditional, and then they go to Big, and they basically learn through community projects that are led by community-based organizations. And it's been amazing, the stories and the successes they've had. So I think this idea of community conversations is really important. And I also think an antidote to some of what we're all seeing and hearing right now around school board meetings and the toxicity of the debates we're having about some of these abstract ideas of, the principles and critical race theory. But really, when you bring people together and you say, what do you want for young people? The answers are surprisingly similar.
Yeah.
And I think when we can start from that baseline, we can have much more productive conversations about what is and is not possible, like at the level of vision and design.
Well, again, it's just so compelling and probably accurate from my perspective as well, is that when you ask what is it that you want for young people, I mean, when you bring student voice into it too, is what is it that you want for yourself? I think there is a level of consistency. That consistency is based on aspiration and hope. But I think that the next piece of it is, so in what ways is what we're doing right now in service to those very clearly articulated and consensus driven aims? And the answer is not as much, not really typically. And so then the next question really is, okay, so how do we begin to move the gap this way? How do we move closer toward our aspirations and ideas? And one of the things that the project that you just mentioned from Cedar Rapids is really very much grounded in this level of holding true to a vision, but being flexible in terms of delivery systems, ways of thinking and working and imagining, which fundamentally is antithetical to it's 10:17. Do you know what child your
Yeah.
child should be in school?
Yes. No, that's right. And, and I love the fact that they designed it to kids still go to traditional high school for part of their week.
Yeah.
And they get what we think of as the core, and then they do this other thing on top. Another example I'll give of this kind of both and, because that's how I think about it, is Andy Forlis, who's the superintendent in Mesa, Arizona,
Mhm.
who, has been thinking for a while about how you move the entire district in this direction, but basically kind of brought all the principals in her district together and articulated a vision and said, okay, like who wants in? And she allowed principals to opt in with their faculty and their school communities. And I think it was only maybe 4 or 5 buildings out of, I'm going to make up the number, but whatever, 17 or 20 in the beginning. And they really started thinking differently about the role of educators. That was the first place that they decided they were going to make it. So how could you think about team teaching, where you had a group of adults that were taking care of a larger group of students, but the roles looked really different.
Mhm.
And they were sharing those stories out. And then more principals kind of came on board and said, we want to do this. And so gradually there are more and more schools in the district that are moving in this direction, having learned from the folks that were sort of on the front end. And so I appreciated that she didn't say, the whole district is going to do this regardless of where you are, but she did set out a vision. And even in the schools that weren't formally in it, there were small steps being taken, right? Around how could we imagine, doing our work differently and inviting educators to do small things every day or every week that just kind of shifted their relationship with their work. And, change is hard. And it's not going to happen overnight. And so I think the question is, if we have a vision that's a 10-year vision that we want to get to, and we know we still have to do work every day with the young people in front of us, the vision might allow us to make different choices about what we do every single day. So instead of doing one more, block class in a day, what if you use that same block for flexibility, where students get to kind of do a genius hour type thing, or have educators teach classes that they're really excited about that may not be core, but it changes the dynamic. So that, I think, is the way that we start bridging that gap in small ways. And it's going to look really different in different contexts based on where folks are, what the conversation is, what the resources are. I found it really interesting that some of the places that are being most flexible and adaptive are rural schools. Where I think they've really leaned into, we're small, we have communities around us, and we are just going to lean all in. And there's some interesting stuff happening in rural communities too.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, so when I'm also sort of processing this, I mean, we're focusing on time, we're focusing on place, we're focusing on the grouping of learners, and we're also thinking about the grouping of staff members, and potentially broader than that, because we are starting to think about how are we conceiving of who's leading the learning. So the notion of things like Genius Hour, maker spaces, but also the notion of pop-up courses where people from the outside could come in, and instead of teaching within a window of 20 minutes, they have a space of 2 hours. So the imaginative pieces of the vision also need to sort of play out in the imagination of structures and spaces and who's partnering in that learning experience, whether it's independent, whether it's somebody from the outside, whether it's within my local community or someone halfway around the world. I mean, that to me is the vibrancy of what you're starting to not only sort of clarify, but also identify a couple of groups and organizations that are not only featured in the book, but you've seen sort of blossom since then.
Yeah, and I think just to underline what you just said, it's why this notion of the instructional model to me is helpful, right? Because if we start with what we're trying to do, the purpose, then we think about what do young people need at this age and how does learning happen? Then we make choices about curriculum instruction and then systems. And you could have system design elements. So I use advisory sometimes as an example. Okay, we're going to focus on an advisory, which is a design piece of our program, but we know that it hits the need for students to have deep relationships with peers and adults. It also gives us a way to help students and adults track where a student is and what they need. It helps us have longitudinal relationships, so a sense of over 4 years, where is a student. So it's hitting 3 or 4 areas of need with one design principle. Similarly, if we try and do pop-up classes where we invite, an external nonprofit in, well, there we might be meeting a need for culturally responsive practice and the need for students to see adults who look like them, who may not be in the teaching force. And we're giving them an opportunity to maybe do social and emotional work through an arts experience, right? So when we start and think about it in this way, we can start to make very strategic choices about the design elements that we're going to bring in, knowing that we can let some others go because they only deal with one piece or one need. And that's, I think, how systems begin to evolve in this more organic, ecological way, right? As opposed to a factory thing where it's like, oh, we need this intervention, so we're going to bolt it on here.
That's right.
Right? It's a very different way of doing it.
Well, and when we started in the very beginning, many moons ago in part one, we started talking about the sort of the purpose of why you wrote the book. And you mentioned very quietly the idea of you also wrote it for policymakers. So I think that's probably the appropriate way to end as we sort of launch that idea in the beginning. So I think on some level, most people will say, this all sounds fabulous. This all sounds great. This is a direction that we want to move to. However, our policymakers have sort of, that's not their vision. So I think the spirit is, in what ways have you seen any kind of inroads into conversations that are happening with the policymakers, both perhaps at the local, state, and national levels, to continue to sort of push some of the parameters aside around things that they have very clear control over, things like seat time, for example?
Well, I mean, there's an exciting announcement that the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Learning is basically going to do away with the Carnegie unit, like at a federal, at a sort of national level, which is really exciting because it then gives states permission to do something similar. I think so. Helena, Montana comes to mind. So I'm going to be doing a book study and a community conversation there. But one very enterprising educator who's part of the teachers union there is working with a legislative interim committee. And she was like, I want you to come in and kind of talk to these folks who are policymakers. What we forget sometimes is policymakers are trying to do 150 things. They're not experts in any of them. And so it becomes incumbent on us, and this is just a broader civics lesson that I think we're all relearning at this moment. We can't just point to them and say, fix it. We have to be the ones who bring new ideas and bring voices of students and parents and community members and say, look, this is the direction you need to go. And in the first instance, I don't actually think they need to pass anything, right? I think in the first phase of change, what they have to do is release people in organized ways. This is not a free for all, but to say, how do we create space inside the system for, again, the coalition of the willing, the folks who are already doing this, to be released from some of these constraints that are the most harmful or the most impeding the work. I also think it's just a really good idea sometimes for us as non-policymakers to sit down. You do that red light, orange light, green light kind of thing where we think there are a lot of red lights, but sometimes those are just stories
Yep.
that we have told ourselves. And when you actually bring a smart group of people together to say, what actually does stand in our way? There's less that stands in our way than we think. And principals and leaders have always known this. The best superintendents and leaders are the ones who kind of block and tackle. And they're like, no, I can totally do this. I may just need to have a conversation, with the next level up. And so I think sometimes that's a really good thing to do as well, is to first have a conversation about what are the actual barriers,
Yeah.
and then be strategic about which one or two are we going to ask people to give us room for. But I think policymakers are open to it. I work in the fundraising space, and I'm hearing funders, more and more open to the idea that there's systemic long-term change that needs to be made. And frankly, that's hard for public systems to invest in.
Yeah.
It's not risky, but it doesn't fit with political cycles. And so how do we get business leaders, foundations, those folks involved as well, because they influence policymakers and say, you know what, this is what we need to do. So we're going to give you cover and support in doing it.
No, it's so intriguing, because the idea of sort of the policymakers as an audience, when you step back, policymakers are also parents. Policymakers are also really, they understand what their own schooling experience looked like and what the world of post-secondary life looks like and how that's continued to evolve. So I think the notion of looking at policymakers as the reason why things are not possible, again, is creating a set of assumptions, stories that continue to build on that, but ultimately starting to say, if we engage in conversations, first and foremost, not to necessarily fix anything in the moment, but the small, bold conversation can be sitting back and doing a book study of your book, sitting back and really engaging and listening to student voices, really starting to understand why students become less and less interested in school at younger and younger ages. So it's moved from a secondary problem to an upper elementary, and dare I say, a lower elementary problem. So I think the interesting part is that this book, Ulcca, is an aspirational one. So I know it goes into a fair bit of history and sort of describing the world as it is, but it's designed to be a platform to think and imagine about what learning can be like. And it's just such an accomplishment to the world of education. It's just a privilege to know you as well. So thank you for joining us.
No, thank you, Allison.
All right. So for more information, some of the examples that Ulcca mentioned in part 3 will be added in the notes if you wanted to link to those examples for further explanation, and we'll go ahead and give you the contact information for Ulcca as well. So thanks again.